Sheriff Adam Coulter was known as the man who kept harmony in the quiet town of Maple Ridge, Georgia. At 45 years old, he had served in law enforcement for nearly 2 decades. With a charismatic smile and the trust of his community, Adam's reputation was untouchable, or so it seemed. Behind closed doors, however, Adam harbored a secret that could shatter everything: an affair with 18-year-old Ruby Prescott, a waitress from the local diner. Ruby was fresh out of high school, filled with dreams of leaving the small town for something bigger. Yet those dreams dimmed when Adam entered her life, luring her in with promises of security and love. Adam's wife, Darlene Coulter, had known something was wrong for months. Their marriage of 22 years had become hollow, and Adam's late-night absences didn't go unnoticed. Darlene had long learned to keep her suspicions to herself, bottling up her anger for the sake of their 2 children, Ellie and Jace. But deep inside, she knew Adam's heart no longer belonged to her. Ruby, meanwhile, was torn between love and fear. Adam's charm had initially swept her off her feet, but as their relationship progressed, she felt isolated. He encouraged her to distance herself from her friends and family, slowly pulling her deeper into his world. Ruby hoped that things would change, but then she discovered she was pregnant. When Ruby broke the news to Adam, his demeanor shifted instantly. The playful, loving sheriff vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating man. "You'll have to get rid of it," Adam told her without a flicker of emotion. Ruby, heartbroken and scared, refused. The pressure mounted as Ruby's pregnancy began to show, and Adam grew increasingly desperate. His reputation, family, and career were on the line. He began avoiding Ruby, and when they did meet, his charm was gone, replaced with anger and manipulation. Adam warned Ruby never to tell anyone, threatening to destroy her if she exposed their secret. Ruby reached out to Darlene in a moment of desperation, hoping to reveal the truth. When Darlene answered the phone, Ruby's courage faltered. Instead, she hung up without saying a word. The call, however brief, planted a seed of suspicion in Darlene's mind, one she couldn't ignore. By mid-September, the weight of the situation became too much for Ruby. With no other options, she decided to confront Adam in person at his home. That night, she stood at his front door, trembling but determined. She could no longer carry the burden alone. When Adam opened the door and saw Ruby, his expression darkened. Darlene, watching from the kitchen, sensed something unusual. She dried her hands on a dish towel and moved toward the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. "What the hell are you doing here?" Adam hissed, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. Darlene listened intently, her suspicions growing with every muffled word. Ruby's voice cracked as she demanded Adam take responsibility, but Adam responded with cold indifference. "You think I'm going to let some kid ruin my life?" he sneered. "You need to disappear." Ruby's heart shattered. She stepped back, staring at the man she thought she loved. "You said you loved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I lied," Adam replied, his voice as sharp as a knife. Darlene's world tilted as she pieced together the horrifying truth from behind the door. The affair, the betrayal, everything clicked into place. For the first time in years, the numbness she had felt turned into something else entirely: rage. The night continued in silence, but the emotional storm brewing between Adam, Ruby, and Darlene was far from over. As Ruby stumbled away into the darkness, Adam slammed the door shut, unaware that he had just set into motion a chain of events that would lead to a night of unimaginable violence. After the confrontation at the front door, Ruby returned to her tiny apartment, devastated. She knew she couldn't fight Adam alone. Panic consumed her every thought. She was pregnant, isolated, and terrified. No one would believe her over the beloved sheriff of Maple Ridge. But Ruby wasn't just scared, she was angry. She was determined to protect herself and her baby, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Darlene's world crumbled under the weight of her newfound knowledge. The betrayal she had suspected for months was now undeniable. But it wasn't just the affair that gnawed at her, it was the cruelty, the way Adam had shattered a young girl's life without a second thought. Years of bottled-up frustration and resentment boiled over, and for the first time, Darlene allowed herself to feel the rage fully. She needed to act, and she knew Adam better than anyone, how dangerous he could become when cornered. If she confronted him directly, she feared for her safety, but if she did nothing, she knew Adam would destroy Ruby, and the young girl would carry the burden alone. In the quiet hours of the night, an idea began to take shape in Darlene's mind. She would get even, on behalf of Ruby, on behalf of herself, and on behalf of every betrayal she had endured. The next morning, Darlene called Ruby. The young girl's voice was hesitant when she answered, but Darlene's tone was calm, almost soothing. "Meet me at the old creek behind the diner. Noon," Darlene said. "We need to talk." Ruby hesitated, unsure if she could trust the sheriff's wife. But something in Darlene's voice, an eerie calmness, convinced her to go. By noon, the two women stood face to face by the murky waters of the creek, both knowing they had reached a point of no return. "I know everything," Darlene said flatly. "The affair, the pregnancy, I heard it all last night." Her eyes welled with tears, but she bit her lip to keep from breaking down. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I don't care how it started," Darlene interrupted, her voice steady. "I care about is how it ends." Ruby looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "We end this," Darlene said, her voice low and deliberate. "For good." The plan they devised was simple, but ruthless. Adam's cruelty had left them both with little choice. He had to be stopped, and they knew the only way to guarantee that was to kill him. Ruby protested at first, but Darlene's cold logic eventually wore her down. "He'll ruin you," Darlene whispered, "and if you think he won't, you don't know him like I do." They decided the murder would take place on the following Friday night. Adam always went to his hunting cabin alone on Fridays, far from town, with no one around to hear what happened. Darlene knew the routine well. She'd lived with it for years. Ruby was to lure Adam to the cabin, pretending to give him one last chance to make things right. Once inside, Darlene would confront him, armed with the revolver he kept hidden beneath the mattress, a weapon she knew he wouldn't expect her to use. As they finalized the plan, an unspoken understanding passed between the two women. They weren't just planning a murder, they were taking control of their lives for the first time in years. And as dark as it was, the thought gave them both a grim sense of relief. On the night of the plan, everything went as expected, at first. Ruby met Adam at the diner, her face carefully composed, masking the fear churning inside her. She told him she wanted to talk, to clear the air, and that she was waiting for him at the cabin. Adam, ever the manipulator, believed he had won. He grinned and told her he'd meet her there. Ruby arrived at the cabin first, her hands trembling as she waited in the dimly lit room. Darlene was already there, hidden in the shadows, her fingers curled around the cold metal of the revolver. The weight of what they were about to do settled heavily on both of them. There was no turning back. When Adam finally arrived, he entered the cabin with the casual confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. "Ruby?" he called out, his voice thick with smugness. "You ready to talk, sweetheart?" Ruby stepped into view, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's over, Adam," she said softly. "This ends tonight." Before Adam could react, Darlene emerged from the shadows, the revolver steady in her hands. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and Adam realized the full extent of his betrayal. Darlene. She didn't give him a chance to finish. With a calm, deliberate motion, she pulled the trigger. The first shot hit Adam in the chest, knocking him to the ground. The second was aimed directly at his groin, a final symbolic act of vengeance. Adam gasped, clutching his bleeding torso, but Darlene showed no emotion. She fired one last shot, ending his life with a bullet to the head. The cabin fell silent. Ruby stared at Adam's lifeless body, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Her hands shook uncontrollably, and tears streamed down her face. But Darlene remained composed, her expression unreadable. "It's done," Darlene whispered, lowering the gun. "We're free." In the dead silence that followed Adam's murder, Darlene and Ruby stood motionless, the weight of what they had done sinking in. Ruby's breath came in short, panicked gasps as her mind raced through the grim reality of the situation. Darlene remained calm, coldly composed, as if the years of betrayal had extinguished any trace of emotion left in her. She knew this wasn't just about revenge. This was survival. "We need to make it look right," Darlene said, breaking the silence. "No one can know." Ruby nodded, though her mind felt numb. Together, they wiped down surfaces and scattered hunting gear around the cabin, attempting to stage the scene as a botched robbery. Darlene carefully placed the revolver in Adam's limp hand, making it appear as if there had been a struggle. Blood pooled beneath his lifeless body, darkening the wooden floorboards as Darlene worked efficiently, as if rehearsing a plan she had practiced for years in her mind. When they finished, Darlene looked Ruby in the eye. "We were never here," she whispered. "You understand?" Ruby gave a shaky nod, and the two women slipped out of the cabin into the night, leaving behind the shattered remains of Adam Coulter's life. The next morning, the town of Maple Ridge was buzzing with shock. Sheriff Adam Coulter, a trusted figure, had been found dead in his hunting cabin. The initial theory, an interrupted burglary, spread quickly, but rumors circulated just as fast. Adam's reputation wasn't as untarnished as it had seemed, and whispers of his affair with Ruby Prescott began to emerge. Detective Paul Harlow, a seasoned investigator from the state police, was called in to handle the high-profile case. He arrived at the crime scene and immediately sensed that something was off. There were no signs of forced entry, and though the room was staged to look ransacked, the disturbance felt deliberate, too neat, too controlled. "This doesn't sit right," he muttered to his partner, Detective Carla Monroe, as they examined the cabin. Forensics later confirmed his suspicions. Adam had been shot 3 times. Once in the chest, once in the groin, and once in the head. The placement of the wounds, especially the shot to the groin, hinted at personal motives far beyond a random burglary gone wrong. "We're dealing with something personal," Harlow concluded grimly. This was no accident. As the investigation progressed, Darlene kept her composure, determined to maintain the facade of a grieving widow. She played her part well, answering questions calmly and attending community memorials with quiet dignity. But Ruby struggled to keep her emotions in check. The guilt gnawed at her, and each encounter with the police sent her heart racing. Detective Harlow's suspicions deepened when he discovered Adam's affair with Ruby. Conversations with locals painted a disturbing picture. Adam had used his position to manipulate the young waitress, isolating her and coercing her into an affair. Ruby's pregnancy only complicated matters further, casting doubt on the initial theory of a burglary. Harlow knew he needed to speak with Ruby directly. When he finally sat down with her at the station, her hands trembled as she answered his questions. She tried to stick to the story Darlene had coached her on, but under Harlow's probing gaze, cracks began to show. "You were close to the sheriff, weren't you?" Harlow asked gently, his eyes never leaving hers. Ruby nodded, avoiding his gaze. "He promised me things," she whispered, "but he lied." Harlow leaned in slightly. "Ruby, I need to know what really happened that night. If you're in trouble, now's the time to say something." Tears welled in Ruby's eyes. She wanted to tell the truth, but fear kept her silent. She shook her head. "I don't know anything," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Harlow wasn't convinced, but without solid evidence there was little he could do. However, he kept Ruby under close watch, certain that the truth would surface sooner or later. As the pressure mounted, Ruby's fragile state unraveled. She stopped returning Darlene's calls, isolating herself out of guilt and fear. Darlene sensed that Ruby was a ticking time bomb, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the young girl broke under the strain. One rainy afternoon, Ruby made a fateful decision. She drove to the police station, tears streaming down her face, and asked to speak with Detective Harlow. Sitting across from him in the dimly lit interrogation room, she finally let it all out. The affair, the threats, the pregnancy, and the night of the murder. It was Darlene, Ruby confessed through sobs. "She shot him. I helped her, but I didn't pull the trigger." Harlow listened in silence, his expression grim. The story was exactly what he had suspected. This wasn't a random crime. It was a carefully planned act of revenge. Ruby's confession gave him the missing piece he needed, but it also raised new questions. "Why confess now, Ruby?" Harlow asked softly. Ruby's eyes were hollow. "I just couldn't live with it anymore," she whispered. The arrest came swiftly. Darlene Coulter was taken into custody, her stoic expression never wavering as officers led her away in handcuffs. At trial, the story of Adam Coulter's double life and the devastating consequences of his betrayal captivated the community. The prosecution painted Darlene as a woman, driven to the edge by years of emotional abuse, while the defense argued that her actions were the result of manipulation and fear. Ruby's testimony proved pivotal. Her detailed account of the murder and Darlene's involvement left no room for doubt. In the end, the jury found Darlene guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a verdict that brought closure to some, but left others questioning whether justice had truly been served. As the years passed, the lives of those involved continued to shift in unexpected ways. Ruby left Maple Ridge, hoping to escape the shadow of her past. She gave birth to her child, a little boy she named Adam, after the father she had loved and feared in equal measure. Darlene, now serving her sentence in a state prison, found a strange sense of peace behind bars. Freed from Adam's control, she began to rebuild herself piece by piece, participating in therapy sessions and writing letters to her estranged children. Detective Harlow, haunted by the case, would later reflect on the tangled web of betrayal, manipulation, and revenge that had led to Adam Coulter's murder. In the end, He would say there were no winners, just survivors. And so, the small town of Maple Ridge moved on, carrying the weight of its secrets and scandals in silence, as it always had. But for those who had lived through it, the memory of that fateful night at the hunting cabin would never fade. This is the story of Sheriff Adam Coulter, a story of love, betrayal, and a desperate act that ended in bloodshed. And as with many stories of human frailty, it leaves only one truth. When trust is broken, the consequences can be deadly.